Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today I have a very special guest, Willie Aames, who played the character of Danny in the episode The Beguiled. Welcome, Willie, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me and all of the Walton fans.
Judy, in the words of Cary Grant. I mean, I am so thrilled to be on your show. A, because you are just one of the most lovely people I ever met in the industry. B, because I really appreciate the stories that you've been telling about the behind the scenes on the Waltons, having been, a one-time Walton alumni. And then we shared we shared Warner Brothers together and Lorimar Productions together. And then, we have many, of course, mutual friends throughout. So I'm thrilled to be here. I really love what you're doing with this. I think it's just a really positive thing. And as somebody who lived it, it's really interesting to see your perspective or David's perspective or Cammy, Eric. Interesting thing that you may not have, I don't know if you knew this. Eric, Scott, and I worked on the very first project I ever got.
Wow.
So back in 1969, there was a show with David Soul called The Young Rebels. And I had been in the business all of a week and a half or 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And I had already done a commercial. I had gotten a Phillips 66 commercial. And the very next gig I got was a small part on this show. And David Soul had just come from Here Come the Brides. He'd finished that show or was in the middle of it. I can't remember. And there were two little kids, and it was about the Revolutionary War. And there were two little kids reading a post from King George III. One was Eric Scott and one was me. And that was like one of my very first gigs.
Wow.
And Eric and I have been friends ever since. And to watch Eric's transformation, because he just kept plugging away and plugging away and plugging away. And then he finally ends up with this massive, iconic hit show. And I could not have been happier for him, So there's a deeper history connected to the Waltons.
Yeah. Well, you're going to give people the wrong impression of Hollywood. There you were, a week and a half. You already had two jobs. And the majority of people, that's the reason why so many people flock to Hollywood thinking, oh, it must be so easy. And you are certainly in the minority in terms of how quickly you were able to get work and the longevity and scope of your career. So,
well,
not to say that can't happen, but it's unfortunately not the norm.
I think what happened was I hit, I love the era of Hollywood that I was able to come into it as a kid. And I hit it at the exact right time where I had the right look. I wasn't a performer. I was just a kid.
Yeah.
And, freckle faced and sort of dirty blonde hair. And that was long before I did the whole teen idol curly, my hair was naturally curly. It was weird. It went straight and then it went curly and now it's what it is. But, you're right. I mean, I consider myself one of the most fortunate people on the planet because I really was able to sort of jump right in, and I've had so many friends. And I'll tell you another. Helen Hunt, Helen and I did a series before Eight Is Enough for the Waltons called Swiss Family Robinson, and Helen had a few jobs, and then just really sort of struggled for a while. I remember I was putting gas in my Jeep, and Helen came in, and I was like, "Oh man, Helen, how you doing?" She's like, "Willie, I'm going to give up. I am so done trying auditioning and trying to get something going." And she's like, "At least one of us is working." And then a short time later, it was Mad About You and As Good as It Gets and an Oscar. And I mean, it's just everybody has these periods of time. Sometimes it's when you start and then you move forward. Sometimes you have this running start, and it's like, wow. And then there's a huge break and then it picks up later. And, it's just there's no rhyme or reason, but I consider myself really fortunate.
Mm. Well, I mean, along with that goes a skill set and talent. And, you had a lot of, most of us, same thing I've heard about our show and how we felt about it was that they allowed us to just be kids and act like kids as opposed to no, none of us really had acting classes. I mean, I had a little bit when I was little, but mostly I find with children, having also taught acting, that they can either they get it or they don't. It's hard to, you can direct them, but I think it's hard to teach someone how to be natural at that age. They either are or they aren't.
I agree with you. And I've mentioned it to a lot of people. I mean, there are some people that I know that wanted to be actors in the worst way, and they were just the worst actors. Um, I really appreciate your determination. It was always easy for me. In fact, Dick Van Patten used to say this to me on Eight Is Enough. He said, "You make it look so easy. You always make it look so easy." And I didn't know that I was making it look easy. I didn't know that I couldn't do it. I mean, it was just not very self-conscious, I think, is what we were doing as kids in the 60s and the 70s, being on TV. I remember when Johnny Depp first came on the scene, and he had that sort of James Dean brooding, like it was very deliberate what he was after. And I remember thinking, wow, that's really, that's a really, focused approach to a business that is not really about being that focused. Like with television, I used to drive Betty Buckley crazy on the set, because she came from acting classes in Broadway and this very studied, very accomplished actress. And she would want to, research the history and the background and really dig into the scripts and really go, through the labyrinth of method acting. And I used to say, look, Betty, we are filler for commercials. We're what happens in between the commercials. This is a business. Like, we don't have time for this. I love what, like what you're doing. And then I'd say, and she'd go, no, we are not in between. And I'd say, Betty, art without revenue is called a hobby. And she would just go insane. And it was this sort of running, barbs between one another. And I adore Betty Buckley. I adore her. She's fabulous and a far better actor than I will ever be. But it really, by the time I had gotten to both the Waltons and Eight Is Enough, I'd done several series, and it was just another gig. Eight Is Enough was like, okay, it's just another gig. I just went from show to show to show to show to show. And I think a part of that was because I was just being a kid. It was because of the family that I was brought up with. And it was because I never took myself or any of it very seriously. I think I was just doing the thing, I mean, I wasn't like really trying to be something new. And I think when you walk into a room, they always say, when an actor walks into the room, you're cast within the first 15 seconds, whether or not you look right, whether or not you sound right, whether, you carry yourself right. You're 90% of the casting is going to happen right then and there. And the other part is not to be desperate. You can sort of smell the desperation and feel the desperation and the push to sort of be into the character. And I think the actors that work the most are the ones that, like, they go and do the audition, forget about it, and walk out. And what's the next one? They don't hang on to it. And that's all I was doing, really.
Yeah. It's interesting because in the episode you did of the Waltons, the Beguiled, where you played Danny, you had a lot of your storyline was with David Harper. And I feel like David was a lot like that as well, as a young performer, that he just sort of showed up and did it. very,
Yeah.
very natural. And, so you two made a good combo in those scenes.
Yeah, and it's funny that when I knew I was going to do your show, and I was thinking about sort of the smells and the feel and the shooting and the days on set, and there was I had to learn how to roll a coin on my fingers, because there was a lot of magic and sleight of hand, and it was the first time I think I'd ever had a studio send me to learn something I didn't already know how to do, like ride a horse or scuba dive or surf or fish or whatever it might be, run around, and I had to go to the Magic Castle and learn how to roll, a half dollar. Of course, I'm little, so half dollar is pretty big, and learn how to do that in some sleight of hand. And I remember thinking, how interesting, and it's to this day, it's like my only magic trick, it's like my only thing where you go, oh, I once did on the Waltons. And I remember David and I both running around the set, and it was instant friendship, it was an instant, was such a likable guy, and such a just, humble, normal guy. And he and I hit it right off, and it was instant friendship. But being on the set was really the most comfortable spot on earth for me. That's what I grew up with. I was a 9-year-old, and if you watch Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you see that little kid that's sitting on the outside the saloon on the Western Street. Well, that was me on Gunsmoke, with Jodie Foster and Aaron Moran and all of these different people, and we grew up doing that stuff, doing Disney, doing the Wonderful World of Disney one week, and then Gunsmoke the next week, and then Courts of Witty's Father a week. So when I look back and I think about it, there's a feel with the period clothing. They have a smell, they have a they do, right? Like they have that sort of musty makeup, like you can smell the makeup in it still.
Yeah.
And the shoes are uncomfortable because they're not padded, and the clothes are a little bit boxy, and that sort of thing. And they always had that sort of been washed too many times so that they looked period. And then there's the smell of the set, and remember we used to have the old arc lights.
Yes.
Where they had the carbon arcs, and they would be trimming and I was always fascinated on the sets with the mechanics of what was happening. And so to watch the grips and the crew, go up there and burn a carbon stick, that would create this white hot light that they would run through a lens and then light up, and outdoors especially, you could smell it. And it was mixed with the soil and the dirt on the back lots, and then the old house, and it smelled of dulling spray and paint where they were making it look older or worn. And then there was what did they used to call this, the dirt, there was a word, and then if they had to get something out,
Fuller's earth.
Fuller's earth, that's what it was. Yeah. And they were that had a smell. And then the Pickren, where they would, and especially on the Waltons where it was period.
Yeah.
And you had these lovely, old cars, and you had, everything was a constant smell. And that, I think, brings back those memories. Like I can still picture the Warner Brothers back lot. I can still picture the house. I can still picture. And then when you went onto the set, it was a different environment and a different smell, because the sound stages had a smell, and they became dark, and the set was lit up, and then you had the makeup tables along the side. And so when I was thinking about my time on the Waltons, those sorts of things came back to me quite a bit, and I really enjoyed it. And I remember really enjoying all of the cast. I didn't spend much time with Ralph. He kind of scared me, but
he was very method.
He was. Yeah. I remember one day I walked in on the set, and it was when I was doing It Is Enough. It was long after I'd done the Waltons, and I walked in on the set, and I tiptoed, because they ring the bell and everybody gets quiet, and then they're going into it, and it was a rehearsal, so it was, so I just kind of walked in and I tiptoed up just to the edge of where the sound stage was dark, and it was kind of, just watching, the scene rehearse. And I remember I got into Ralph's eye line,
Oh.
and he let me have it, man. Like, he really let me have it. I was like, whoa. I didn't realize, like, I did not realize that I had distracted him like that. And I said, kind of scurried out of the way, like, but he was a great actor, and not unkind. But I do understand. I think the other thing about that, and it taught me a lesson. I mean, is the point is that Ralph taught me a lesson that I wouldn't wake up to until years later. As a kid, when you're just doing your thing, that's one thing. As an adult, when you're doing it, it's a little more difficult to put yourself in that space where you can focus on what the character is thinking and going through. And I remember being distracted one time in a scene on a movie, and the thought of somebody walking through my eye line, and the thought of Ralph came right back, like right back. And I was like, that's what he meant. I got it. I finally understood, I mean, quite frankly, when it first happened, I was like, what an asshole. And then, and then it wasn't until later where I was like, I get what he means now. I understand what he means by that now. And so I'll always thank him and never forget it.
Yeah. And I think, like, I remember watching this slightly different analogy, but tennis, and when in the era of Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe, and McEnroe would have, and Connors would have these big fits, about line calls, and and I later thought, I think part of this becomes a way to energize yourself when things aren't going right, and it's sort of like switch the energy, and them lighting up on somebody, I think, was a way for them to get their energy going, and elevate the energy of their play. And I think sometimes with someone like Ralph, I think it was also because it would happen sometimes when he was maybe a tougher scene, a more, whatever was going on for the character, maybe he wasn't quite feeling it the way he wanted to. It wasn't going the way he wanted to. And I think sometimes that would be more likely to trigger, there's someone there, or, sort of that way of trying to motivate yourself, and that it didn't mean anything. It wasn't personal, but it was just, I can't focus. And so anything that's in the way becomes a target. And then you can go, okay, good. Now I have energy. Now I can work. Because I don't think people realize how much acting is about the energy moving through your body to be able to create that sense of real life and real emotion.
And it also speaks to sort of my, youthful arrogance of what's the big deal? This is, we do this every day. And I mean, there really, I think there's a lot of moments like that throughout my career, my life, where when you begin to take it for granted and you are not respecting what process you're allowed to have on the set. And today, I mean, you have no time to process. There is almost zero directing going on television today. You go in, if you get 2 takes, you're lucky, and you're done and you're on. And the directors are more worried about the technical aspect of it. Did the shot go? Was the focus, sharp? Was it this, and this? And as long as they didn't see anything that was egregious, like, okay, great, we're moving on, because it really is. In fact, I found it quite jarring when I came back after, 15 years or so of not really doing any television. And I was actually a bit offended. I was like, I mean, the director didn't even speak to you. And we were, lucky to have that. So I think in the youthful arrogance of the moment, and having been so blessed with, such an easy time, I didn't understand an actor that understood the stakes
Mm,
of being in a scene that required focus
mm,
and needed that focus, and maybe had been in the middle, if I really think about it, maybe had been in the middle of what he felt was the real take or the real moment. And here this guy walks
mm.
in through the middle of it. I mean,
Yeah, it's a
it's a
good
little
point.
like getting ready to kiss your girlfriend and she belches. Um, like, and when I say, when I vocalize my first impressions of the moment, and also the embarrassment, of having been called out in front of a whole set of people, doesn't make Ralph a bad person, because on every other instance, whether it was a Hollywood Christmas parade or, a network event or something like that, he was lovely. I mean, I don't think he had any clue as to who it was, or that it was personal. So it's interesting how those moments really, really begin to shape your life,
Mm,
shape your character on the set, and learning things, and whether it was Ralph Waite or whether it was Michael Landon or Tony Randall. It was Tony Randall's son on The Odd Couple prior to that, and I was on Little House on the Prairie prior to that, and so I kind of got to do all of these different things. And I think those really established actors all had that sort of pressure and knowledge that there's a lot at stake for every scene, and the idea is to get it right, do the best job you possibly can in the amount and the environment that's given to you, and then move on.
mm.
And so I hold no ill memory with Ralph Waite.
I want to thank Willie for being my special guest. I'll be back with more of my fascinating, in depth conversation with Willie Aames on another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. And I'll see you again soon with more Behind the Scenes of the Waltons and more Ask Judy. Thanks for watching.